Hi team, this is the final video for the muscle chapter, chapter 9 in Marriott. This is energy from muscle contraction. So we've gone over this before. Here's the neuromuscular junction. So the action potential comes down the motor neuron axon, and that change in voltage in the axon terminal causes release of calcium via voltage-gated calcium channels into the axon terminal. Axon terminal then releases the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and then through a series of molecular events that engages an action potential down the muscle, and the muscle dives into the T-tubule here, and that causes voltage-gated calcium channels and other calcium channels to release calcium into the muscle cell. And then once calcium is present, you come over here in the bottom, calcium can bind to troponin and tropomyosin, and it moves that complex out of the way of the myosin head binding sites on actin, so that the myosin heads can then form cross bridges, and then eventually through cross bridge cycling, the sarcomeres shorten and the whole muscle can contract. ATP is needed for cross bridge cycling because you can see here, here's ADP and inorganic phosphate, so you can't see the ATP, but the ATP was hydrolyzed into ADP and inorganic phosphate. So you need ATP for cross-bridge cycling. You need ATP for the sodium-potassium pump. That's this cartoon up here, where you pump 3 sodium out into the extracellular fluid for every 2 potassium that you pump in. And then also the SR, so that's this blue stuff here, that's sarcoplasmic reticulum, and you need ATP to pump the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum when you're done with the muscle contraction. So ATP is really important. It's immediate and only source of energy for muscle contraction, at least immediately. It's stored in muscle fibers, but you use it up really quickly. But then there's other ways to generate ATP from other molecules that we'll talk about. So after you use up all your ATP, then other pathways have to be utilized to make ATP, and those other pathways are what we're going to talk about initially. So in this cartoon, this is from Marriott, if you have that book. This is aerobic versus anaerobic metabolic pathways. So in this cartoon, it shows here at the top, stage 1, it says the GI tract. So here's some delicious food that you might eat. Protein, so steak and eggs, carbs, pasta and bread, oil, or fats would be like oil, cheese, and butter. And then the proteins can be broken down into amino acids, carbs get broken down to glucose and other sugars like fructose. Fats get broken down into glycerol and fatty acids. And then stage 2 of metabolism, the tissue cells do their work. So you can see on this side of the cartoon, the amino acids, you can make proteins out of amino acids. Amino acids can go into this metabolic pathway called glycolysis, which we'll talk about. Glucose can go into the glycolytic pathway. Glucose, if there's excess glucose, you can store it as glycogen. And then glycerol can also go into this pathway called glycolysis. And you can see, well, it's actually a biochemical pathway, and there's lots of steps with enzymes, but basically in glycolysis, what we're going to focus on is you take one glucose molecule, C6H12O6, and you start breaking it down in this pathway called glycolysis, and you can, through a series of biochemical events, you can make ATP. And it also shows in this cartoon, in this metabolic pathway called glycolysis, you release a molecule of carbon dioxide. If oxygen is present, you can continue breaking down the glucose molecule, C6H12O6, goes to this linker step of acetyl-CoA, and then the pieces of the glucose molecule that are left can go into this thing called the citric acid cycle, where more carbon dioxide is released, and then products from glycolysis and citric acid cycle can go into this process called the electron transport chain, where you do this thing called oxidative phosphorylation. So you phosphorylate ADP into ATP, and you need oxygen to do that, and water and carbon dioxide, or sorry, water. This is a water molecule. Water is released. In the key here, it says the blue arrows are catabolic reactions, so catabolism, that's where you break things down. The purple arrows are anabolic reactions, that's where you build things up. So for example, in our cartoon, when glucose is built into this glycogen molecule, that would be an anabolic reaction because you're building a molecule. When you take glycerol and fatty acids from fat and make triglycerides, you're building something. That's an anabolic reaction. When you take glucose and break it down, that's a catabolic reaction. And at glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation in the electron transport chain, you make ATP. So this is just a really sort of a skeletal outline of all the biochemistry that goes on when you break down glucose to make ATP. So glycolysis can be anaerobic. That means it doesn't use oxygen. Citric acid, it can also be defined as being an anaerobic pathway because it doesn't need oxygen. But you can see the oxygen molecule coming into the electron transport chain, so the electron transport process is aerobic because it does use oxygen. So if you're a skeletal muscle, you can do both aerobic and anaerobic respiration, or aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. But if you're a cardiac muscle cell, you depend on aerobic cell respiration to make ATP. You don't use anaerobic cell respiration to make ATP. So let's take a look at this cartoon. There's 3 ways to make ATP. But before we do that, let's look at this cartoon. So here it says aerobic respiration of glucose. So this is a little tricky because glycolysis, if oxygen is present down the line, glycolysis can take a glucose molecule and, through a series of biochemical events, make ATP and this thing called pyruvic acid. And if oxygen is present, pyruvic acid can go into the mitochondria and do aerobic respiration. So we can use the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain to make a whole bunch of ATP. In glycolysis, you can make ATP by this process called direct phosphorylation of ADP. So you can phosphorylate ADP in glycolysis to make ATP. If you run out of ATP, you can use this molecule called creatine phosphate. So in this cartoon, CP is creatine phosphate. So if you run out of the ATP in your muscle, you can use creatine phosphate. So it's got this phosphate on it. You can take the phosphate from creatine phosphate and you can put that phosphate on ADP, and that will make ATP. So you go from having 2 phosphates to 3 phosphates, and then you make this product called creatine. So direct phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate, which is this cartoon, is how muscle cells store energy, so in the form of creatine phosphate. One way to, so that's one way to generate ATP. The second way to generate ATP is aerobic respiration. So aerobic respiration is when oxygen is present and you can take a glucose molecule and tear it down in glycolysis, the Krebs cycle inside the mitochondria, and the electron transport chain, and then you make a whole lot of ATP. If oxygen is not present, then glycolysis will be anaerobic. So glycolysis at the end will form pyruvic acid, but then that pyruvic acid can't go to the mitochondria to make more ATP because no oxygen is present. So that pyruvic acid becomes lactic acid. And you probably heard lactic acid, feel the burn when you're working out your muscle too hard. Oh, and here's a cartoon for that. So this is anaerobic glycolysis of glucose. So you do glycolysis. So that glycolysis is just breaking down the glucose molecule into pyruvic acid. And then if there's no oxygen present, you make lactic acid. And you can see the big X here through the oxygen. Okay. So in this cartoon is the energy systems used during sports. So in the first 6 seconds, she's sprinting hard. ATP stored in the muscles is used up. And then in the next 10 seconds, you use creatine phosphate to make ATP from ADP. That's direct phosphorylation because you're putting a phosphate on ADP, but you're taking that phosphate from creatine phosphate. And then for the next 30 to 40 seconds to the end of the exercise, remember glycogen is a storage form of glucose, so glycogen can be broken down to glucose, and then that glucose is oxidized or put through the metabolism or biochemistry to make ATP. And then if you are a distance runner, you're doing prolonged duration exercise, you can make ATP by breaking down several nutrient energy fuels by an aerobic pathway. So oxygen will be present because you're going a long, slow distance. So the oxygen will be there during that 2-hour run. And you can use several different nutrient energy fuels for fat. So fat, for example. Okay, here's our cartoon again, just showing anaerobic glycolysis. So that's when oxygen is not present, glucose gets broken down to pyruvic acid. But then you can't break that pyruvic acid down anymore. It just gets converted to lactic acid. And you can only make ATP in anaerobic glycolysis. But if oxygen is present, the end product of glycolysis, pyruvic acid, can go into the mitochondria, and through the Krebs cycle and electron transport, you can make a whole bunch of ATP, 32. And I just say here, so during vigorous exercise, so let's say you're running stairs, there may be insufficient oxygen to completely break down pyruvic acid, so you convert it to lactic acid. And then in this cartoon, so we've talked about this, just gives you a little more details with creatine phosphate. You don't need to use oxygen when you convert creatine phosphate to ATP. You get 1 ATP molecule per 1 creatine phosphate molecule. And you can use this creatine phosphate to make ATP for about 15 seconds of exercise. So we've kind of already talked about this aerobic respiration. You take glucose molecule, so let's say you eat some bread and it's broken down into glucose, and then that glucose goes through glycolysis, makes pyruvic acid, and then if oxygen is present, then pyruvic acid can go into the mitochondria, where you can do aerobic respiration of pyruvic acid, and you can make, through Krebs cycle and electron transport, you can make a whole bunch of ATP. You can also take fatty acids and amino acids into this aerobic respiration to make a lot of ATP. Okay. Anaerobic glycolysis. So in this cartoon, we've talked about this. Here's glucose. So you eat some bread, get the glucose molecule, C6H12O6. And through a bunch of biochemistry that we're not going to go into, that C6H12O6 gets partially broken down into pyruvic acid. And then because there's no oxygen present, pyruvic acid is converted to lactic acid. And then the lactic acid is released into the blood, and that's where you feel the burn when you're exercising at a high level. So you can do this for about 40 seconds of intense energy production needed for a workout. And so take away from this, the glucose molecule is broken down to pyruvic acid to produce about 2 ATP in glycolysis. Anaerobic glycolysis is not as efficient as aerobic glycolysis, but it's fast and you can make ATP. But you need a whole bunch of glucose, and that glucose molecule doesn't get completely broken down, and you only make a small amount of ATP in anaerobic glycolysis. Lactic acid then, as you know, produces fatigue and soreness. So kind of talked about this already. ATP is used first in the muscles. Then in the next 10 seconds, ATP is formed from creatine phosphate. So in this quick and intense anaerobic exercise, so she's like a sprinter, the muscle, so you use up ATP, and then creatine phosphate is a really high energy molecule, and you can, I guess you can buy it in powder form in the stores. Okay, muscle fatigue and oxygen deficit. So here's the anaerobic pathway. So you've oxygen, you don't have oxygen there, so you have to break down your glucose to make ATP through an anaerobic process, and then the pyruvic acid is converted to lactic acid. So if muscle activity is strenuous and prolonged, muscle fatigue occurs because the lactic acid accumulates in the muscle, and then the ATP supply decreases. And then you also get ionic imbalances that cause the muscle to fatigue. And then after you exercise, you have an oxygen deficit, so you have to do rapid and deep breathing. And if you exercise too hard and you get a muscle strain, the standard treatment is RICE. You guys probably know this. R is rest, ice for I, compression of the sore muscle for C, and then elevation of the sore muscle. So that's the standard treatment for muscle strain. And this is just, I just cut and pasted, screen captured, sorry, from Marieb if you wanted to read more about muscle fatigue. It's kind of interesting. I think in the previous video I talked about muscle tone, but muscle tone is a result of a staggered series of nerve impulses delivered to different cells within the muscle. So basically, let's look at the purple motor neuron, and it serves these 3 muscle cells. Staggered series of nerve impulses delivered to different cells within the muscles. So if, let's say this is for muscle tone, let's say this is a cartoon of the erector spinae muscle, so the muscles in your back that keep you erect. So they've always got some level of contraction, so aka tone. So what happens is, like, the purple motor unit will be stimulated and then it will relax. The red motor unit will be stimulated and then it will relax. And they'll go back and forth between those 2 motor units, but at all times, part of this erector spinae muscle in your back is contracted to give you muscle tone. Effective exercise on muscle, you guys know this. Exercise increases your muscle size, strength, and endurance. You have aerobic or endurance exercise, you get stronger, you get more flexible muscles, and your muscles have greater resistance to fatigue. It makes your metabolism more efficient, improves your digestion, your muscle coordination. And then resistance exercise, like weightlifting, increases muscle size and strength. So now we're going to talk about the types of muscle fibers. I don't know why this bottom part came on down here, but it did. So let's look at the first one. the types of muscle fibers. The first one is a slow oxidative fiber. So the muscle fiber, remember muscle fiber is the same thing as a muscle cell. A slow oxidative fiber or cell is small in diameter. They're fatigue resistant though. They don't get tired very easily. There's a ton of mitochondria, and slow oxidative fibers are in muscles where you're trying to maintain your posture and endurance activities. So those Olympic athletes that do the marathons, they would have a lot of slow oxidative fibers. And those slow oxidative fibers are slow twitch, and they're red in color. So slow oxidative fibers are red. And you can see that like in the meat that you buy, different colors. I mean, well, maybe you don't see it in the processed meat, but if you go to a farm, you can see different colors of muscles in the animals. The next type of muscle fiber is a fast oxidative glycolytic fiber. So it's intermediate diameter of the cell, and it works a little faster than the slow oxidative fiber, but it's briefer in duration of contraction, and it's adapted for walking and sprinting. And then the next fiber is a fast glycolytic fiber. So it's really large diameter. It can contract really strong and really quick. But it also gets tired really quickly too. It's designed, your fast glycolytic muscle cell or muscle fiber is designed for short, rapid, and intense movement, like weightlifting or throwing a ball. And there's there's two types of these, type 2A and type 2X. So type 2A is fast twitch. It's oxidative glycolytic, so that's number 2 here. It's red in color. And then these last ones, the fast glycolytic fibers, are white in color. So here's a question. What type of muscle fiber would you want for the following? So what would you want if you're taking a long, relaxing swim? Well, if you said slow oxidative fiber, you'd be right. What if you're trying to climb in the gym? So you need you need bursts of power, but then climbing, could be an hour or 2 hours. So maybe for that you'd want fast oxidative glycolytic fibers. Playing baseball or basketball, maybe again fast oxidative glycolytic. But what if you're an Olympic sprinter? What would you want? You would want the fast glycolytic fibers, large diameter, short, rapid, intense movement.